They stood there silently, my son and his boss, blank faces refusing even to lift their voices to help me understand what was happening in my own son's workplace. I was left alone in a crowded cafe in downtown Chicago, clutching a crumpled message I couldn't read, abandoned, invisible. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Agnes, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived in this city for over 4 decades, watching it change from my 15th floor window in a building that's seen better days. The sounds of Chicago fill my mornings, car horns echoing off brick walls, the distant rumble of the train, sirens that never seem to stop. But none of those sounds hurt as much as the silence that had settled between my son David and me. That morning started like all the others. I woke at 5:30, my body refusing to sleep later despite the exhaustion that seemed to live in my bones. The apartment felt cold, always cold, no matter how high I turned the heat. I made myself a cup of coffee, the cheap kind from the corner store, not the fancy stuff David drinks at his office, and sat at my small kitchen table, looking out at the gray October sky. I had dressed carefully that day. It was David's 35th birthday, and I wanted to surprise him at work. I chose my navy blue dress, the one I bought for his college graduation 15 years ago. It still fit, though it hung a little looser now. I pinned my grandmother's brooch to the lapel, a small silver butterfly that caught the light when I moved. I wanted to look presentable, worthy of being seen with my successful son. The tech startup where David worked occupied the 20th floor of a gleaming building in the Loop. I'd never been there before. He'd always made excuses when I asked to visit, saying it wasn't appropriate, that his workplace had strict policies about family members. But it was his birthday. Surely, they'd understand a mother wanting to bring her son a small gift and take him to lunch. I clutched the gift in my hands, a leather portfolio I'd saved up for over 3 months. Every dollar counted on my fixed income, but I wanted to give him something professional, something that showed I understood his world even if I couldn't always navigate it myself. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt endless. My heart pounded with anticipation and nervousness. Would he be happy to see me? Would his colleagues think I was intruding? The doors opened to reveal a modern office space filled with young people typing on laptops, their conversations a mix of technical jargon and casual English that flowed too fast for me to follow. I approached the reception desk, where a young woman with perfectly styled hair looked up at me with polite confusion. I tried to explain in my careful English that I was David Morrison's mother, that I wanted to surprise him for his birthday. She smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes and asked me to wait while she checked if he was available. That's when I saw him. David emerged from a conference room with a woman I assumed was his boss, tall, blonde, wearing an expensive-looking suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. They were deep in conversation, their voices low and urgent. When David saw me sitting in the waiting area, his face changed. Not with joy or surprise, but with something that looked almost like panic. He walked over slowly, the woman following behind him. I stood up, my hand shaking slightly as I held out the wrapped portfolio. "Happy birthday, Mijo," I said softly, using the Spanish endearment that had slipped out despite my efforts to speak only English in public. David glanced nervously at his boss before responding. "Mom, what are you doing here? You can't just show up at my work unannounced." His voice was cold, professional, as if I were a stranger interrupting an important meeting. The woman extended her hand to me with a practiced smile. "You must be David's mother. I'm Sarah Chen, his supervisor." Her handshake was firm but brief, and I noticed how she glanced at her watch immediately after. I tried to explain that I just wanted to take my son to lunch for his birthday, that I hadn't seen him in weeks. But as I spoke, I realized they were having a conversation right in front of me that I couldn't follow. Their words came too quickly, filled with terminology I didn't understand, and when I asked David to explain what they were discussing, he just shook his head. "It's just work stuff, Mom. Nothing you'd be interested in." The dismissal stung more than I expected. Sarah added something that made David's face flush with embarrassment. I caught fragments, something about appropriate boundaries and professional environment, but the meaning felt deliberately obscured from me. They weren't even trying to include me in their conversation. That's when I noticed the document in Sarah's hand. It looked official, with letterhead and signatures, and I caught a glimpse of numbers that made my breath catch in my throat. They were familiar numbers, numbers that looked suspiciously like the account information from my investment portfolio, the one I'd set up years ago to help David's career. I asked David directly what the document was, and he exchanged another look with Sarah. "Mom, please. Can we talk about this later? I'm in the middle of something important." But I pressed, my instincts telling me something was wrong. That's when Sarah spoke up, her voice taking on a sharp edge. Mrs. Morrison, with all due respect, this is a private business matter. David doesn't need to translate every detail of his work for you. The words hit me like a physical blow. Translate. As if I were some foreign entity who didn't deserve to understand what was happening in my own son's life. As if my inability to quickly process complex English made me less worthy of respect or inclusion. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, the shame that came with being made to feel small, inadequate, different. But underneath the shame was something else, a growing suspicion that I was being deliberately kept in the dark about something that concerned me directly. David suggested we go to the cafe downstairs to talk privately, but even there, the conversation remained frustratingly one-sided. He ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, speaking to the server in rapid English while I sat silently, still clutching my unopened purse. "Mom, you have to understand," he said once we were seated at a small table near the window. "My workplace has certain expectations. You can't just show up whenever you want." I wanted to tell him that I hadn't seen him in over a month, that his phone calls had become shorter and less frequent, that I missed him with an ache that kept me awake at night. But the words felt too heavy, too needy. Instead, I asked again about the document I'd glimpsed upstairs. His jaw tightened. "That's confidential business information. It has nothing to do with you." But I knew my son's tells, the way his left eye twitched when he wasn't telling the truth, the way he avoided eye contact when he felt guilty. These were the same expressions I'd seen when he was 7 years old and had broken my favorite vase, or when he was 16 and had crashed the car. "David," I said quietly, "those numbers looked familiar. They looked like my account numbers." The color drained from his face so quickly that I knew I'd hit on something significant. He started to stammer, to deflect, but I held up my hand. "I may not speak perfect English," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "but I'm not stupid. If my money is involved in your business, I have a right to know." The cafe around us continued its normal rhythm, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of other customers, the clink of cups and saucers, but at our table, silence stretched between us like a chasm. David stared into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to questions he didn't want to face. Finally, he looked up at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the corporate mask he'd learned to wear so well. "Mom, it's complicated. The startup needed initial funding, and Sarah thought it would be good to have some family investment. It's all legitimate, all legal. You're listed as a silent partner." Silent partner. The phrase echoed in my mind as I walked home that evening, leaving David to return to his important work. Silent. As if my opinions didn't matter, my questions didn't deserve answers, my very presence was an inconvenience to be managed rather than welcomed. The elevated train ride back to my neighborhood gave me time to think, to piece together fragments of conversations and half-truths that had been accumulating for months. The investment account I'd opened at David's suggestion, supposedly for my retirement security. The papers I'd signed without fully understanding, trusting my son to guide me through the complex language. The monthly statements that showed activity I didn't recognize. That evening, I spread all my financial documents across my kitchen table. The numbers swam before my tired eyes, but slowly, patterns began to emerge. Money had been moving in and out of my accounts in ways that made no sense for a simple investment portfolio. Large sums had been transferred to business accounts I'd never heard of. The returns I'd been promised weren't materializing, but fees and administrative costs seemed to multiply every month. I called David that night, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice distracted and impatient. "Mom, I'm really busy right now. Can this wait until the weekend?" "No," I said firmly. "It can't wait. I need you to explain these account statements to me. Tonight." There was a long pause before he sighed heavily. "Look, I told you it's complicated. You don't have the background to understand the financial details. Just trust me, okay? Everything is fine. Trust me." Those words had guided so much of my adult life. I'd trusted my husband when he said he'd provide for our family, and then he died in a car accident when David was 12, leaving us with more debt than assets. I'd trusted the bank when they said the mortgage modification would help us keep the house, and then we lost it anyway. I'd trusted my son when he said this investment would secure my future. But lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while traffic hummed 16 floors below, I realized that trust without transparency isn't trust at all, it's willful blindness. And I'd been blind for far too long. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called the investment company directly, armed with my account numbers and social security information. The customer service representative was patient with my questions, and slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. My account, which I thought contained my modest life savings plus some growth, was actually serving as collateral for business loans I knew nothing about. Worse, the account was set up with David as the primary contact, meaning all communications were going to him rather than to me. I was essentially funding his business venture without my informed consent, and when I asked about the returns I'd been promised, the representative explained that venture capital investments were high risk and that losses were not uncommon. Losses. The word hit me like a cold wave. I wasn't just being kept in the dark, I was being financially exploited by my own son. Have you ever felt that moment when your entire understanding of a relationship shifts? When you realize that someone you love and trust has been treating you not as a person worthy of respect, but as a resource to be managed and exploited? It's a kind of death, the death of innocence, of unconditional trust, of the comfortable illusions that let us sleep at night. I spent the next weeks in a strange state of suspended animation. I went through the motions of my daily routine, grocery shopping at the corner market, attending Mass at St. Catherine's, watching the evening news, but everything felt different. Colors seemed muted. Food tasted like cardboard. Even Mrs. Garcia from down the hall, who usually brightened my day with her cheerful gossip, couldn't break through the fog that had settled around me. I started paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked. The way David's voice changed when I asked about money. How he always seemed to be in meetings when I called during business hours. The expensive clothes and restaurant receipts I glimpsed when he occasionally visited. The new car he'd bought without mentioning where the money came from. 3 weeks after my visit to his office, David called to ask for what he termed a small favor. Sarah's startup was expanding, and they needed additional short-term funding to secure a major contract. Could I liquidate some of my CD investments to help them bridge the gap? It would only be for a few months, he assured me, and the returns would more than compensate for any early withdrawal penalties. How much? I asked. $25,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but Mom, this could set us up for life. This contract could make the company, and you'll benefit from that success. $25,000. It represented nearly half of what remained in my savings after the previous investments I'd made in his career. It was my safety net, my insurance against medical emergencies or unexpected expenses. It was the money I'd planned to use if I could no longer live independently, if I needed assisted living or long-term care. I need to think about it, I said. David's tone shifted immediately. Think about what? Mom, this is time-sensitive. The opportunity won't wait for you to get comfortable with the numbers. You said you wanted to be part of my success, this is how you do it. But I held firm. I said I need to think about it. That weekend, David came to visit, something he hadn't done in months. He brought flowers, grocery store carnations, not the expensive arrangements he used to surprise me with, and took me to lunch at a family restaurant in our neighborhood. Throughout the meal, he painted grand pictures of the success that awaited us if I just had faith in his vision. Sarah says the profit projections are incredible, he said, cutting into his sandwich with more force than necessary. We're talking about returns that could triple your investment in less than 2 years. I watched my son, really watched him, as he spoke. His eyes were bright with excitement, but there was something else there too. Desperation, maybe. Or fear. His hands moved constantly as he talked, gesturing, fidgeting, never quite still. This wasn't the confident businessman from his office. This was a scared young man who was in over his head. David, I said gently, what happens if this contract doesn't come through? What happens to my money then? He waved dismissively. That won't happen. Sarah has inside information that this is practically guaranteed. But what if it does? What if I lose everything? For a moment, his mask slipped completely. I saw panic flash across his features before he regained control. Mom, you have to stop thinking so negatively. This is business. There's always some risk, but the potential rewards answer my question. My voice was firmer than I'd expected. What happens if I lose everything? David set down his sandwich and looked directly at me for the first time during our meal. Then we'll figure it out. We're family. I'll take care of you. But even as he said the words, they rang hollow. This from the son who forgot my birthday last year until 2 days later. Who hadn't visited when I had pneumonia. Who considered my presence at his workplace an embarrassment to be managed rather than a joy to be celebrated. I told him I needed more time to consider his proposal. He left that afternoon visibly frustrated, and I didn't hear from him for over a week. During those silent days, I found myself remembering David as a child. The way he used to sit in my lap while I read him stories, his small body warm and trusting against mine. How he'd run to me with scraped knees and broken toys, confident that I could fix anything. The pride in his voice when he introduced me to his teachers as my mom, who works 2 jobs to take care of us. When had I become a burden instead of a source of comfort? When had my need for information and inclusion become an inconvenience? When had my son learned to see me not as a person with valid concerns and feelings, but as an obstacle to his ambitions? The answer came to me gradually, through small observations and painful realizations. It had started years ago, after David graduated college and began his career in tech. The industry was fast-paced, youth-oriented, dismissive of anyone who didn't speak its particular language fluently. David had absorbed those values, learning to see experience and wisdom as outdated concepts, tradition as something to be disrupted rather than respected. Somewhere along the way, he'd begun to see me through that lens. My questions weren't thoughtful concerns, they were signs that I didn't understand modern business. My caution wasn't wisdom, it was fear-based thinking that held back progress. My need for transparency wasn't reasonable, it was micromanagement from someone who lacked the sophistication to appreciate complex financial strategies. And slowly, gradually, he'd stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as what I represented: aging, immigrant, working class, traditional. Everything his new world taught him to move beyond. The realization hit me on a Tuesday morning while I was folding laundry. The simple domestic task that had once brought me peace, the smell of clean clothes, the rhythmic motion of matching socks, suddenly felt like evidence of my own irrelevance. How many times had David dismissed my opinions by referencing my limited formal education? How often had he suggested that I didn't understand because I'd never worked in an office environment? I set down the shirt I was folding and walked to my bedroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was 72 years old, with silver hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of worry and laughter. Her hands were marked by years of hard work, cleaning houses, caring for children, managing a household on very little money. She was wearing a simple house dress and slippers, the uniform of someone whose primary role was behind the scenes, invisible to the important people making important decisions. But that woman had raised a son from the age of 12 without any help. She'd worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, sacrificing her own comfort to ensure his opportunities. She'd managed finances through economic recessions, immigration challenges, and personal losses that would have broken weaker people. She demonstrated more practical business knowledge in running a household on a tight budget than most corporate executives ever learned in business school. When had I allowed myself to believe that my experience didn't matter? When had I accepted that my concerns were less valid than David's ambitions? That afternoon, I walked to the library branch in my neighborhood, a solid brick building that had been my refuge for decades. I checked out books on investment strategies, business law, and financial planning. If David wasn't going to explain the complexities of our situation to me, I would educate myself. The reading was difficult at first. The language was technical and dense, and I found myself looking up terms and concepts that the authors assumed readers would already understand. But I persevered, taking notes on index cards and creating my own glossary of financial terminology. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. What David had presented as a straightforward investment opportunity was actually a complex web of business loans, venture capital arrangements, and personal guarantees that put my entire financial future at risk. I wasn't just investing in his startup, I was essentially co-signing for debts that could drain my accounts completely if the business failed. More troubling, I discovered that the decision-making power over my investments had been structured in a way that gave David and Sarah significant control over my money without requiring my ongoing consent. I was listed as the funding source, but they were authorized to make transactions on my behalf based on what they determined were business necessities. The scope of the deception took my breath away. This wasn't just a son asking his mother for financial help. This was a calculated exploitation of my trust and my limited understanding of complex financial instruments. But the betrayal went deeper than money. It was the casual dismissal of my intelligence, the assumption that I couldn't understand or contribute meaningfully to decisions about my own financial future. It was the way David had learned to manage me rather than respect me, to see my questions as problems to be solved rather than concerns to be addressed. I closed the last book and sat quietly in the library's reading room, surrounded by the whispered conversations of other patrons and the soft shuffle of pages turning. An elderly man at the next table was reading a newspaper, his weathered hands gentle with the pages. A young mother was helping her child sound out words in a picture book, her voice patient and encouraging. These were people who understood that knowledge comes in many forms, that wisdom exists outside of conference rooms and corporate hierarchies. They knew what David had forgotten, that treating someone with respect doesn't require them to prove their worthiness first. The walk home through my neighborhood reinforced that sense of perspective. I passed Mrs. Chen at the corner market, whose English might be limited but who could calculate complex pricing in her head faster than any computer. I waved to Mr. Rodriguez, who'd built a successful landscaping business despite never attending business school. I nodded to Mrs. Johnson, who'd managed the finances for her church for 30 years and kept the organization solvent through multiple economic downturns. These people would never be invited to speak at tech conferences or featured in business magazines. But they understood something that David's generation seemed to have forgotten, that real success comes not from how much money you can generate, but from how you treat the people who love and support you along the way. That evening, I called my son. He answered on the second ring, his voice hopeful. "Mom, have you made a decision about the investment opportunity?" "Yes," I said calmly. "The answer is no." The silence stretched so long I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, David's voice came back, tight with controlled frustration. "What do you mean, no? Did you even look at the projections I sent you?" "I looked at everything," I replied. "And I've decided I'm not comfortable with the arrangement." "Mom, you're making a huge mistake. This is exactly the kind of opportunity that could set you up financially for the rest of your life. But it's time sensitive. If you wait too long to decide, I have decided." My voice was steadier than I felt. "The answer is no." What followed was a conversation unlike any we'd ever had. David cycled through multiple strategies to change my mind, logical arguments about market potential, emotional appeals about family loyalty, subtle threats about what might happen to our relationship if I didn't support his career goals. But for the first time in years, I held firm. Every time he tried to redirect the conversation back to his needs, I brought it back to my concerns. When he dismissed my questions as evidence of my limited understanding, I calmly referenced the research I'd done and the experts I'd consulted. The conversation ended with David hanging up abruptly, but not before he'd said something that revealed the depth of his disrespect. "Fine. But don't come crying to me when you're old and broke and living in some nursing home because you were too scared to take a smart financial risk." The cruelty of the statement took my breath away. This was my son threatening to abandon me if I didn't submit to financial exploitation. This was the child I'd raised offering to withhold his love if I didn't fund his ambitions. I sat in my kitchen after we hung up, the phone silent in my hands, and felt something break loose inside me. It wasn't anger, exactly, though anger was part of it. It was more like a dam giving way, allowing years of accumulated hurt and disappointment to rush forward all at once. How many times had I made excuses for David's behavior? How often had I told myself that his distance and dismissiveness were just signs of his busy career, his changing lifestyle, his natural progression toward independence? How frequently had I blamed myself for not understanding his world rather than holding him accountable for not including me in it? But that night, sitting alone in my apartment with the city lights twinkling beyond my window, I stopped making excuses. I stopped accepting responsibility for other people's choices to treat me badly. I stopped believing that asking for respect and transparency was too much to expect from someone who claimed to love me. The next morning, I called the investment company again. This time, I wasn't asking for information, I was giving instructions. I wanted all future communications sent directly to me, not to David. I wanted to review and personally authorize any transactions involving my accounts. I wanted copies of all agreements and contracts that involved my money. The representative was helpful and professional, walking me through the steps to regain full control over my financial accounts. It was embarrassing to admit how much authority I'd unknowingly ceded to my son, but it was also empowering to take that authority back. The process took several days and required multiple calls, forms, and authorizations. But by the end of the week, I had a clear picture of my financial situation and complete control over my investment decisions. What I discovered was worse than I'd feared. Over the past 3 years, nearly $60,000 of my savings had been funneled into David and Sarah's startup through various investment vehicles and loan arrangements. The business was struggling financially, behind on multiple payments, and facing potential bankruptcy within the next 6 months. My money, the nest egg I'd spent decades building, was essentially gone. But rather than despair, I felt an odd sense of relief. The uncertainty was over. The mystery was solved. I now knew exactly where I stood, and while the situation was dire, at least it was clear. The hardest part was accepting that David had known about the company's financial troubles when he'd asked for the additional $25,000. He wasn't seeking investment in a promising opportunity, he was desperately trying to shore up a failing business with his mother's life savings. And when I'd asked difficult questions, when I'd expressed reasonable concerns, he'd dismissed them not because I lacked understanding, but because I was getting too close to the truth. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my friend Elena, David's godmother, who lived in Philadelphia. We'd lost touch gradually over the years, the way longtime friendships sometimes fade when life gets busy and complicated. But Elena had known me when David was young, when we were both struggling single mothers trying to build better lives for our children. Her voice was warm and familiar when she answered the phone, and within minutes we were talking as if no time had passed at all. I told her about my situation, not just the financial betrayal, but the emotional distance, the casual dismissal, the way my son had learned to see me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. Elena listened without judgment, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding and sympathy. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Agnes," she said gently, "do you remember when our boys were teenagers, and we used to worry about them getting involved with the wrong crowd? We were so afraid they'd fall in with kids who would use them, manipulate them, convince them to do things that went against everything we'd taught them." I remembered. Those had been sleepless years, filled with anxiety about peer pressure and bad influences. "Well," Elena continued, "sometimes the wrong crowd isn't other teenagers. Sometimes it's a whole culture that teaches people to value success over character, profit over people, ambition over love. David didn't just get a job in tech, he got indoctrinated into a way of thinking that sees everyone as either an asset or a liability." Her words resonated with painful truth. David hadn't suddenly become a terrible person. But he'd absorbed values that made it acceptable to exploit even the people closest to him if it served his professional goals. He'd learned to see relationships as transactions and love as leverage. Elena and I talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon, and by the end of the conversation, I felt less alone than I had in months. She reminded me of who I was before I became defined by my son's success or failure, a strong woman who'd survived tremendous challenges, built a life from nothing, and raised a child under impossibly difficult circumstances. "You didn't fail as a mother," she said firmly. "You raised him with good values. If he's chosen to abandon those values, that's his decision and his responsibility. But you don't have to enable it, and you don't have to sacrifice yourself trying to fix it." The conversation with Elena marked a turning point for me. Over the next several weeks, I began to rebuild my sense of self outside of my identity as David's mother. I started attending a senior center in my neighborhood, where I met other women who'd faced similar challenges with adult children. I joined a book club at the library, rediscovering my love of reading that had been pushed aside by years of worry and caretaking. Most importantly, I began setting boundaries with David. When he called demanding to know why I'd changed the investment account authorizations, I calmly explained that I needed more control over my own financial future. When he accused me of not trusting him, I agreed. Trust had to be earned through transparency and respect, and his recent behavior had demonstrated neither. The conversation was difficult and emotional. David was angry that I'd essentially cut off his access to my money without warning. He accused me of sabotaging his career, of being selfish and short-sighted, of failing to understand the bigger picture. But I held firm. I explained that I was willing to have an honest conversation about our financial relationship, but only if he was prepared to be completely transparent about the company's situation and my legal obligations. I wanted to see all contracts and agreements. I wanted to understand exactly how much money was at risk. I wanted to be treated as an equal partner in decisions that affected my financial future. David refused. He claimed that involving me in the business details would be too complicated, too time-consuming, too difficult for me to understand. He wanted me to trust his judgment and support his decisions without question. So I made my own decision. I hired a lawyer. The attorney I consulted was a woman in her 50s who specialized in elder financial abuse. She reviewed all my documents and explained my legal options with patience and clarity. What David and Sarah had done might not have been criminal, but it had certainly been unethical. They'd structured their business arrangements to maximize their access to my money while minimizing my ability to oversight their decisions. The lawyer helped me understand that I could potentially recover some of my losses, but it would require legal action that might permanently damage my relationship with my son. She also explained that even if I chose not to pursue recovery, I had every right to protect my remaining assets from further exploitation. The hardest thing for parents to accept, she told me during our second meeting, is that loving your children doesn't mean enabling their destructive behavior. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no. I spent days considering my options. Pursuing legal action would almost certainly end my relationship with David, at least temporarily. But continuing to allow him to exploit my financial resources would eventually leave me homeless and destitute. Either way, our relationship was fundamentally damaged. The deciding factor came from an unexpected source, David himself. 2 weeks after I'd hired the lawyer, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. I was surprised to see him. He never visited without calling first, and immediately suspicious about his motivations. He looked terrible. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. For a moment, I felt a flicker of maternal concern, the automatic impulse to comfort and protect that had guided so much of my adult life. "Mom," he said, pushing past me into the apartment, "we need to talk." He paced around my small living room like a caged animal, his nervous energy filling the space with tension. Finally, he turned to face me, his expression desperate and pleading. "The company is in trouble," he admitted. "Worse than I told you before. We're facing bankruptcy unless we can secure emergency funding in the next month." I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to expect some kind of response from me. When I remained silent, he pressed on. "I know you're angry about the investment structure. I know you think I should have explained things better. But Mom, this could be our last chance to save everything. If you could liquidate your remaining CDs, maybe take out a reverse mortgage on the apartment, we could save the company and protect both of our investments." The audacity of the request took my breath away. He was asking me to risk my home, my only remaining security, to bail out a business that had already consumed most of my life savings. And he was presenting it not as a favor he was requesting, but as a smart financial decision that would benefit both of us. "David," I said quietly, "the company isn't our investment. It's your business, funded by my money, structured to give you control while I bear the risk. And now you want me to risk my housing to protect your career." His face flushed with frustration. "Mom, you're not understanding the full picture. This isn't just about the startup. Sarah says the tech sector is about to explode, and if we can just hold on for another year." "Sarah," I interrupted. "The same Sarah who refused to translate your business conversation for me? The same Sarah who structured these investments to minimize my oversight and maximize my risk exposure? That Sarah?" David's jaw clenched. "Sarah is a brilliant businesswoman. She's trying to protect all of our interests, but she needs partners who understand the long-term vision instead of getting bogged down in petty details." Petty details. My life savings were petty details. My need for information and transparency was getting bogged down. My concerns about financial security in my old age were obstacles to their long-term vision. In that moment, I saw my son with perfect clarity. This wasn't temporary stress talking, or the desperation of someone facing unexpected hardship. This was who David had become, someone who genuinely believed that his goals were more important than other people's security, that his ambitions justified exploiting even the people who loved him most. "No," I said simply. David blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What? No. I won't liquidate my remaining savings. I won't take out a reverse mortgage. I won't risk my home to fund your business." The answer is no. What happened next was a conversation I'll never forget, not because of what was said, but because of what was revealed. David didn't argue with my reasoning or try to address my concerns. Instead, he attacked me personally. He told me I was being selfish and small-minded. He said I was holding him back from success because I was jealous of his education and opportunities. He accused me of never really believing in him, of always expecting him to fail. He suggested that my immigrant background made me too conservative and fear-based to understand contemporary business strategies. Each accusation was designed to hurt, and they succeeded. But they also revealed something important. David saw our relationship primarily as a means to an end. When I stopped being useful to his goals, I became an obstacle to be overcome or an enemy to be defeated. The conversation ended with David storming out of my apartment after delivering a parting shot that cut deeper than anything else he'd said. "Fine. Be poor and alone if that's what you want. But don't expect me to take care of you when you're 90 and living in some state facility because you were too stupid to invest in your own son's success." The threat was clear: support his business ventures or face abandonment in my old age. Love me on his terms or don't expect love at all. It was February. It was February in Chicago, which meant gray skies and bitter cold that seemed to settle into your bones and stay there. But as I watched my son walk away from my building, disappearing into the afternoon shadows, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. The uncertainty was over. The pretense of a loving relationship had been stripped away, revealing the transactional arrangement that had taken its place. David saw me as a financial resource, not a person. His affection was conditional on my usefulness. His respect was dependent on my submission. But recognizing the truth, however painful, was liberating. I no longer had to wonder if I was being overly sensitive when he dismissed my concerns. I no longer had to make excuses for his emotional distance or blame myself for not understanding his world. I no longer had to pretend that exploitation was love or that financial abuse was family loyalty. That night, I called my lawyer and told her I wanted to pursue all available legal remedies to recover my losses and protect my remaining assets. It wasn't about revenge, it was about survival. At 72 years old, I couldn't afford to lose any more money to someone else's failed dreams, even if that someone was my own son. The legal process was slow and emotionally exhausting. It required me to document years of financial transactions, to explain repeatedly how I'd been manipulated into arrangements I didn't fully understand. It meant admitting publicly that I'd been exploited by my own child, which brought its own kind of shame and humiliation. But it also connected me with other people who'd faced similar situations. Through support groups and counseling services, I met parents who'd been financially abused by adult children, spouses who discovered their partners had emptied their retirement accounts, elderly people who'd been swindled by relatives and caregivers they'd trusted. Their stories were heartbreaking, but they were also inspiring. Many had managed to rebuild their lives, to establish new relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation, to find joy and purpose beyond their roles as caregivers and providers. One woman, Maria, had been particularly influential in my recovery. Her daughter had stolen her identity and run up tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt in her name. The discovery had been devastating, not just financially, but emotionally. Like me, Maria had struggled with the realization that someone she loved had been treating her as a victim rather than a person. The hardest part, Maria told me during one of our coffee meetings, wasn't losing the money. It was accepting that my daughter could look at me and see not a mother who sacrificed everything for her, but an easy mark who wouldn't fight back. Her words resonated deeply. That's exactly what David had done. He'd counted on my love and loyalty to prevent me from protecting myself. He'd assumed that I would accept any treatment rather than risk losing his affection, however conditional that affection had become. But Maria had also shown me that recovery was possible. She'd rebuilt her credit, established new friendships, and created a life centered around her own values rather than her children's expectations. Most importantly, she'd learned to recognize her own worth independent of her role as a mother. You can love your children forever, she'd told me, but that doesn't mean you have to let them destroy you. As spring arrived in Chicago, bringing warmer weather and longer days, I found myself emerging from the emotional winter that had consumed the previous year. I was still pursuing legal action against David and Sarah, but I was also building a new life that didn't revolve around their decisions or approval. I started volunteering at a literacy center, helping other immigrants improve their English skills. The work reminded me of my own journey learning the language, and I found deep satisfaction in helping others navigate the challenges I'd faced years earlier. My students didn't see my accent as a limitation or my questions as delays. They saw me as someone who understood their struggles and could guide them through the process of building new skills. I also began attending a support group for parents estranged from adult children. The term estranged had been difficult to accept at first, it seemed so final, so dramatic. But as I listened to other parents' stories, I realized that estrangement wasn't always about dramatic fights or permanent cutoffs. Sometimes it was simply the natural consequence of refusing to enable destructive behavior. Many of the parents in the group had tried for years to maintain relationships with children who treated them badly. They'd made excuses, provided financial support, and accepted disrespectful treatment because they were afraid that setting boundaries would mean losing their children entirely. But they discovered what I was learning, that relationships based on fear and exploitation aren't really relationships at all. The group meetings were held in the basement of St. Catherine's, the same church where I'd attended Mass for decades. But these Wednesday evening gatherings felt different from Sunday services. There was no pretense here, no requirement to present a perfect family image or to maintain the fiction that love alone was enough to solve every problem. We talked honestly about our disappointments, our guilt, our grief for the relationships we'd hoped to have with our children. We also shared strategies for building fulfilling lives that weren't dependent on our children's choices or approval. It was in this group that I first began to understand that my worth as a person wasn't determined by David's success or failure, and that I could love him without sacrificing myself to his ambitions. Summer brought unexpected developments in my legal case. The investigation had revealed that David and Sarah's financial irregularities extended beyond their treatment of my investments. They'd also misrepresented the company's financial status to other investors, violated several SEC regulations, and failed to properly disclose conflicts of interest in their business dealings. While this meant that my case was stronger than expected, it also meant that David was facing potential criminal charges in addition to civil liability. The son I'd raised to be honest and ethical was being investigated for fraud. The news hit me harder than I'd anticipated. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the financial exploitation and emotional abuse, I still loved David. The thought of him facing criminal charges, of his career being destroyed, of his future being permanently damaged, broke my heart. I considered dropping the legal action. My lawyer cautioned against it, explaining that David's financial crimes extended far beyond what he'd done to me, and that the investigation would continue regardless of my participation. But the maternal instinct to protect my child was still strong, even after everything he'd done. It was Elena who helped me gain perspective during one of our regular phone calls. "Agnes," she said gently, "you didn't cause this situation. David's choices created these consequences, not your decision to protect yourself. You can't save him from the results of his own actions, and trying to do so will only enable him to continue hurting other people." She was right, of course. If David was willing to exploit his own mother's love and trust, he would certainly do the same to strangers and business partners. My silence wouldn't protect him, it would only allow him to continue victimizing other people. But understanding the logic didn't make the emotional reality any easier. I was still wrestling with conflicting feelings of love and betrayal, protectiveness and self-preservation, when David made the decision for me. In late July, he contacted me through his lawyer. The message was brief and cold. He was willing to settle our civil case if I agreed not to cooperate with the criminal investigation. He was essentially asking me to obstruct justice in exchange for recovering a portion of my stolen savings. The request revealed just how completely David had lost his moral compass. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or offering to make amends. He wasn't acknowledging the harm he'd caused or expressing remorse for his actions. He was trying to manipulate me one more time, using my financial desperation to coerce me into helping him evade legal accountability. I instructed my lawyer to reject the settlement offer. If David wanted to rebuild our relationship, it would have to be through honest acknowledgement of his actions and genuine efforts to make amends, not through additional attempts at manipulation and control. The criminal case moved forward without any cooperation from me, based on evidence that prosecutors had gathered independently. In September, David and Sarah were both indicted on multiple counts of investor fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. The local business press covered the story extensively, and I found myself reading articles about my own son's alleged crimes with a mixture of heartbreak and vindication. The coverage revealed details about their business practices that I hadn't known. They'd been running what was essentially a Ponzi scheme, using new investments to pay returns to earlier investors while siphoning off significant amounts for personal expenses. My money hadn't just funded their startup, it had paid for David's expensive apartment, Sarah's luxury car, and their frequent business trips to conferences and meetings. But reading about David's crimes in the newspaper also forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my own behavior. I'd been so eager to be supportive of my son's career, so proud of his apparent success, that I'd ignored obvious warning signs. When he started wearing expensive clothes and dining at high-end restaurants despite claiming his startup wasn't yet profitable, I'd assumed business was better than he'd let on. When he avoided specific questions about the company's finances, I'd told myself he was protecting proprietary information. I'd been willfully blind to evidence that might have protected other investors if I'd spoken up sooner. My desire to maintain a positive relationship with David had prevented me from asking the hard questions that might have exposed his fraudulent activities before they expanded. This realization brought its own kind of guilt. While I was clearly a victim of David's financial abuse, I'd also been inadvertently complicit in enabling his crimes against others. My silence and my willingness to trust without verification had allowed him to continue his fraudulent activities for years longer than might otherwise have been possible. The guilt was almost overwhelming at times. I would lie awake at night thinking about the other investors who'd lost money because I hadn't demanded transparency earlier. I wondered about the elderly people who might have been scammed because I'd been too embarrassed to admit that I didn't understand the complex financial arrangements my own son was using to exploit me. But the support group helped me work through these feelings without losing sight of the larger truth, that victims of financial abuse are not responsible for their abusers' choices, even when those abusers are their own children. I could acknowledge my mistakes and learn from them without accepting blame for David's decisions to commit fraud. As autumn arrived in Chicago, bringing golden leaves and crisp air that felt like a fresh start, I began to notice changes in myself that went beyond the legal and financial aspects of my situation. I was sleeping better, eating with more appetite, and finding genuine enjoyment in activities that had felt merely like distractions during the darkest months of the previous year. The volunteer work at the Literacy Center had expanded into a part-time tutoring role, and I was discovering talents and interests I'd forgotten I possessed. My students appreciated not just my language skills, but my life experience and practical wisdom. They asked for advice about navigating bureaucracy, managing household finances, and dealing with discrimination, areas where my decades of experience as an immigrant and single mother provided valuable guidance. For the first time in years, I felt useful not because someone was exploiting me, but because I had genuine skills and knowledge to offer. The difference was revelatory. When David had needed my financial support, I'd felt important but also anxious, always worried about whether I was giving enough or understanding his needs correctly. When my students asked for help, I felt confident in my ability to provide valuable assistance without sacrificing my own well-being. I was also rediscovering friendships and social connections that had been neglected during the years when my emotional energy was focused primarily on David and his needs. Elena and I spoke regularly now, and I'd reconnected with several women from church who'd tried to maintain contact even when I'd been too preoccupied to reciprocate consistently. These relationships felt different from my dynamic with David. They were reciprocal rather than one-sided, supportive rather than demanding, accepting rather than conditional. When I spent an afternoon with Mrs. Garcia, she was interested in my thoughts and experiences for their own sake, not because she was hoping I could solve her problems or fund her ambitions. The contrast helped me understand just how dysfunctional my relationship with David had become. Real love, I was learning, didn't require constant sacrifice from one party for the other's benefit. Healthy relationships involved mutual support, shared decision-making, and respect for each person's autonomy and boundaries. October brought the first major development in David's criminal case. He agreed to a plea bargain that would avoid jail time in exchange for admitting guilt to reduced charges, paying substantial fines and restitution, and accepting a period of supervised probation. The agreement also required him to cooperate with investigators pursuing cases against other white-collar criminals in similar schemes. The news was both relief and disappointment. I was glad that David wouldn't face imprisonment, but frustrated that he'd avoided the full consequences of his actions through legal maneuvering rather than genuine accountability. The plea agreement included restitution to investors, but the amounts were calculated based on the company's limited remaining assets, meaning that most victims, including me, would recover only a small fraction of their losses. More significantly to me personally, the plea agreement made no mention of any personal accountability to family members he'd exploited. While David was required to acknowledge his crimes against investors broadly, there was no admission of wrongdoing specifically toward me, no recognition of the personal betrayal involved in exploiting his own mother's trust and love. I realized that I'd been holding on to hope that the legal process would somehow force David to confront the personal dimension of his actions, to recognize how his behavior had damaged our relationship, to express genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. The plea agreement made clear that wouldn't happen through the court system. If David was ever going to acknowledge the personal harm he'd caused, if our relationship was ever going to be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, it would have to happen through personal choice rather than legal compulsion. 2 days after the plea agreement was announced, David called me directly for the first time in over 6 months. I was so surprised to see his name on my caller ID that I almost didn't answer. When I did, his voice sounded different, quieter, more tentative than I'd heard him in years. "Mom," he said simply, "I know I don't have any right to ask, but I was hoping we could talk." My first instinct was to protect myself. Every previous conversation with David had left me feeling manipulated, dismissed, or hurt. I had no reason to believe this call would be different, and every reason to be cautious about giving him another opportunity to cause emotional damage. But I also heard something in his voice that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability that reminded me of the child he'd once been. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet with him. We met at a small restaurant in my neighborhood, on neutral territory where I felt comfortable and in control. David arrived looking much older than his 35 years. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans that looked as if they'd seen better days. His hair needed cutting, and there were worry lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year earlier. For the first few minutes, we made awkward small talk about the weather and the restaurant. But eventually, David looked directly at me and said something I'd never heard from him before: "Mom, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between us. I waited for the qualifications, the excuses, the explanations that would minimize his responsibility or shift blame back to me. But they didn't come. Instead, he continued, "I'm sorry for using your money without really explaining what I was doing. I'm sorry for dismissing your questions and acting like you didn't deserve answers. I'm sorry for treating you like a business resource instead of like my mother. I'm sorry for threatening to abandon you when you wouldn't do what I wanted. I'm sorry for everything." The apology was broader and more specific than I'd expected. He wasn't just acknowledging the financial crimes that the court system had addressed, He was recognizing the personal betrayal, the emotional abuse, the fundamental disrespect that had characterized our relationship for years. But I'd been hurt too deeply to accept his words at face value. "Why now?" I asked. "What's different about today?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his untouched coffee. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. "Because I lost everything," he said quietly. "The company, the money, my reputation, my career prospects. Sarah won't even return my calls. I'm probably going to have to move back home with Mom." He stopped abruptly, realizing the irony of what he'd just said. "Except I don't have a home to go back to anymore, do I? I destroyed that too." For the first time in our conversation, he sounded like the little boy who used to come to me when he was sad or scared. But I also heard something else, the recognition that he'd brought these consequences on himself through his own choices. "I keep thinking about what you said the last time we talked," he continued. "About how I only saw you as being useful or not useful. And you were right. That's exactly how I was thinking. Not just about you, but about everyone. Everyone was either helping me get what I wanted or getting in my way. I couldn't even see it at the time, but that's not how you're supposed to treat people you love." The admission was painful to hear, but also validating. For years, I'd felt like I was losing my mind, wondering if I was being unreasonably sensitive when David's behavior felt hurtful and dismissive. His acknowledgement confirmed that my perceptions had been accurate. He really had been treating me as a means to an end rather than as a person worthy of respect and consideration. "When did it change?" I asked. "When did you start seeing me that way?" David thought for a moment. "I think it was gradual. When I started working in tech, everyone was so focused on metrics and optimization and efficiency. Everything was about maximizing outcomes and minimizing friction. And I guess I started applying that mindset to everything, including family relationships." He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "Sarah used to tell me that emotional decisions were bad business decisions. She said successful people learn to separate their feelings from their strategies. And I thought that made sense. I thought it made me more professional, more sophisticated." The mention of Sarah brought back all my anger and hurt. "So this was her idea? Using my money and keeping me out of the decision-making?" "No," David said firmly. "I mean, yes, she suggested ways to structure the investments that would give us more flexibility. But Mom, she didn't force me to lie to you or dismiss your questions or any of the other things I did. Those were my choices. I was the one who decided that your concerns weren't important enough to take seriously." His willingness to take full responsibility, without deflecting blame onto Sarah or business culture or external circumstances, surprised me. The David I'd been dealing with for the past few years had always had explanations for why his behavior was really someone else's fault, why circumstances had forced him to act in ways that hurt other people. But I wasn't ready to forgive simply because he was finally being honest. Too much damage had been done, too much trust had been broken. "What do you want from me, David? Why did you ask me to meet with you?" "I want to try to rebuild our relationship," he said without hesitation. "I know I don't deserve it. I know you have every reason not to trust me or to want me in your life. But I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to prove that I can do better." "And what would that look like?" I asked. "How exactly do you plan to prove that you've changed?" David had clearly thought about this question before our meeting. "First, I want to pay you back as much as I can. I know there's no timeline for that, and I know the amount I've lost is more than I'll probably ever be able to repay in full. But I've been working with a financial counselor, and I have a plan to pay back a significant portion over time, assuming you're willing to accept payments." The offer was unexpected. The court-ordered restitution would provide me with a small fraction of what I'd lost, but David was volunteering to pay additional money beyond his legal obligations. It wouldn't restore my financial security, but it would make a meaningful difference in my day-to-day situation. More importantly, it suggested that his apology wasn't just words. He was willing to make concrete sacrifices to repair the damage he'd caused. "Second," he continued, "I want to be completely transparent about my finances and my life going forward. I know you probably don't want to be involved in my business decisions again, and I understand that. But I want you to know that you'll always have access to honest information about my situation. No more secrets, no more half-truths." "And third?" I prompted. "Third, I want to start over with our personal relationship. I want to spend time with you not because I need something from you, but because I love you and I miss you. I want to hear about your life, your interests, your opinions, even when they're different from mine. Especially when they're different from mine." The proposal was more comprehensive than I'd expected. David wasn't just apologizing for his past behavior, he was laying out a specific plan for how he intended to behave differently in the future. It felt genuine in a way that his previous explanations and promises never had. But I'd been disappointed by David too many times to accept his words without skepticism. How do I know this isn't just another manipulation? How do I know you won't go back to treating me badly as soon as your life gets better? David nodded as if he'd expected the question. You don't know. I can't prove my intentions to you through words. The only way to rebuild trust is through consistent actions over time. All I can ask is that you give me a chance to show you that I've learned something from losing everything. We talked for another hour, covering practical details about repayment plans and communication boundaries, but also sharing memories and feelings that we hadn't discussed in years. David asked about my volunteer work, my support group, my friendship with Elena. He seemed genuinely interested in the life I'd been building for myself, not because he wanted to evaluate its impact on him, but because he cared about my happiness and well-being. When we said goodbye outside the restaurant, David hugged me for the first time in over a year. It felt different from his previous embraces, less perfunctory, more present. Thank you for giving me a chance, he whispered. I love you, Mom. Walking home through my neighborhood, I felt cautiously hopeful for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. David's apology hadn't erased the pain he'd caused or restored the trust he'd broken, but it had opened a door to the possibility of healing. Over the following months, David kept his promises. He found work as a software consultant, accepting positions that paid significantly less than his previous role but offered steady income without the ethical compromises that had characterized his startup experience. He set up automatic monthly payments to my bank account, small amounts that gradually began to make a difference in my financial situation. More importantly, he stayed in regular contact without asking for anything in return. He called every Sunday, not to update me on his problems or seek my advice on his decisions, but simply to talk. He remembered details about my volunteer work and asked follow-up questions about people I'd mentioned in previous conversations. When I had a minor medical procedure, he offered to drive me to the appointment and stay with me during recovery. The relationship that emerged was different from what we'd had before, both before his betrayal and during his childhood. It was more equal, built on mutual respect rather than hierarchical obligation. David treated me as an independent adult with my own interests and opinions, not as an extension of his goals and needs. I began to understand that the exploitative dynamic between us hadn't started with his career in tech or his relationship with Sarah. It had roots that went back much further, to patterns of interaction that had developed during his childhood and adolescence. I'd been so focused on providing for David, on ensuring his opportunities and success, that I'd inadvertently taught him to see me primarily as a resource rather than as a person. Part of rebuilding our relationship involved acknowledging my own contributions to the unhealthy patterns that had developed over the years. While David was responsible for his choices and actions, I could recognize ways that my parenting style had emphasized service and sacrifice over mutual respect and healthy boundaries. This recognition was painful but also liberating. It meant that rebuilding our relationship wasn't just about David changing his behavior, it was about both of us learning new ways of relating to each other that honored our individual worth and autonomy. As winter returned to Chicago, bringing shorter days and the familiar bite of lake-effect wind, I reflected on how much had changed in the year since David's financial crimes had been exposed. I was still living in the same apartment, still struggling with limited financial resources, still dealing with the practical consequences of having lost most of my life savings. But I was also stronger, more confident, and clearer about my own worth and boundaries. The relationships in my life were healthier, based on mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. I discovered interests and abilities that had been dormant for years, and I'd connected with a community of people who valued my contributions and enjoyed my company. Most surprisingly, I'd learned that my worth as a person wasn't dependent on my children's success or my ability to solve other people's problems. I could love David without sacrificing myself to his ambitions. I could be a good mother without enabling destructive behavior. I could maintain family relationships while still protecting my own well-being. The legal proceedings finally concluded in December, with David completing his community service requirements and beginning the first payments of court-ordered restitution. The amounts were disappointingly small, but they represented acknowledgement of harm done and a commitment to making partial amends. More meaningful to me personally were the voluntary payments David had been making consistently for 6 months, and the gradual rebuilding of trust that had accompanied his changed behavior. He'd followed through on every promise he'd made, maintained transparency about his finances and activities, and invested genuine effort in understanding my perspective and experiences. By the first anniversary of our confrontation in the restaurant, I felt comfortable enough to invite David to my apartment for dinner, the first time he'd been there since the day he'd stormed out after I'd refused to fund his latest business venture. The apartment looked the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. We cooked together, something we hadn't done since David was a teenager. He helped me prepare a simple meal while we talked about books we'd been reading, places we wanted to travel, memories from his childhood that we both treasured. The conversation was relaxed and natural, without the undercurrent of tension and calculation that had characterized our interactions for so many years. After dinner, David noticed the framed photo on my mantelpiece, a picture of him at his college graduation, beaming with pride and possibility. It was the same photo I'd looked at so many times during our estrangement, wondering how the hopeful young man in the image had become someone willing to exploit his own mother's love and trust. "I remember that day," he said quietly. "I felt like the whole world was open to me, like anything was possible." "You were so proud," I replied. "And I was so proud of you." "I wish I could go back and make different choices," David said. "I wish I could have held on to the person I was that day instead of becoming someone who would hurt you." "You can't go back," I told him. "But you can choose who you want to be going forward. And from what I've seen this year, you're becoming someone I can be proud of again." The conversation reminded me of something my mother used to say when I was young and made mistakes: "Every day is a chance to start over." At the time, it had seemed like an oversimplification. But now I understood its wisdom. David couldn't undo the harm he'd caused, but he could choose to be different going forward. And I could choose to give him that opportunity while still protecting myself and maintaining healthy boundaries. As we sat in my living room that evening, sharing memories and hopes for the future, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent from my life for years. This wasn't the relationship I'd originally wanted with my adult son, it was better. It was honest, reciprocal, and built on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. Spring came early to Chicago that year, bringing warmth and renewal that felt symbolic of the changes in my own life. The literacy center where I volunteered was expanding its programs, and I was offered a coordinator position that would provide additional income while allowing me to use skills I'd developed through years of managing complex family and financial challenges. Elena visited for a long weekend in April, our first in-person reunion in over 5 years. She was amazed by the changes she saw in me, not just my improved mood and energy, but the confidence and self-assurance that came from having established healthy boundaries and learned to value my own worth. "You're like a different person," she told me over dinner at a restaurant in Little Italy. "Not different in who you are, but different in how you see yourself." She was right. Through the painful process of confronting David's exploitation and rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms, I'd rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing. I was still a loving mother, a loyal friend, a caring community member. But I was also a person worthy of respect, consideration, and honest treatment from the people in my life. That summer, I did something I hadn't done in decades: I took a vacation just for myself. Using savings from my part-time work and David's repayment plan, I traveled to New York City to visit museums, attend theater performances, and explore neighborhoods I'd only read about. It was the first time in my adult life that I'd spent money on my own enjoyment without feeling guilty or worrying about someone else's needs. The trip was revelatory in ways I hadn't expected. Walking through Central Park, visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art, watching a Broadway show, I remembered aspects of myself that had nothing to do with my roles as mother, caretaker, or provider. I was someone who appreciated art, who enjoyed learning about history, who found joy in new experiences and beautiful surroundings. For years, I defined myself almost entirely through my relationships with other people: how well I was meeting their needs, how successfully I was supporting their goals, how completely I was sacrificing my own interests for their benefit. The trip reminded me that I was a complete person with my own interests, opinions, and desires that had value independent of their impact on anyone else. When I returned to Chicago, David noticed the difference immediately. "You look happy," he said during one of our Sunday phone calls. "Really happy, in a way I haven't seen in years." He was right. I was happy, not because all my problems had been solved or because I'd recovered from all the losses I'd experienced, but because I'd learned to find joy and meaning in my life that didn't depend on other people's validation or approval. The happiness felt sustainable in a way that my previous contentment never had. When I derived my sense of worth primarily from my success as David's mother, my emotional well-being had been constantly at risk. Every sign of his disapproval or distance had threatened my sense of self. Every indication that I was failing to meet his needs had shaken my confidence in my own value. But happiness that came from within, from my own accomplishments, my own relationships, my own sense of purpose, was more stable and reliable. David's approval was still important to me, but it was no longer essential to my basic sense of worth and satisfaction. This shift had profound implications for our relationship. Because I no longer desperately needed David's love and approval, I was able to interact with him from a position of strength rather than insecurity. I could express disagreement with his decisions without fearing that he'd withdraw his affection. I could maintain my own boundaries without worrying that he'd abandon me. Paradoxically, this made our relationship more genuinely loving rather than less so. When David showed me kindness or consideration, I could appreciate it as a gift rather than desperately clutching it as proof of my worth. When we disagreed about something, I could express my perspective honestly rather than automatically deferring to his wishes out of fear. By the second anniversary of our confrontation in the restaurant, our relationship had stabilized into something that felt genuinely healthy and sustainable. We spoke regularly, but not obsessively. David continued making his monthly payments, both court-ordered and voluntary, but our conversations didn't revolve around financial topics. We enjoyed each other's company, but we also maintained independent lives and interests. Most importantly, we'd learned to disagree respectfully when our opinions differed. When David expressed political views I didn't share, or made life decisions I wouldn't have chosen, I could listen thoughtfully and offer my perspective without feeling like I had to change his mind or defer to his judgment. Similarly, David had learned to seek my opinions not because he needed my approval, but because he valued my experience and wisdom even when they led to different conclusions than his own analysis. The relationship wasn't perfect, no relationship is. There were still moments of tension, misunderstandings that required clarification, old patterns that occasionally resurfaced despite our mutual efforts to change. But these challenges were manageable within the framework of mutual respect and honest communication that we'd established. More importantly, our relationship was no longer defined by the crisis that had nearly destroyed it. While we both remembered the pain of that period and the lessons we'd learned from it, we were creating new memories and new patterns of interaction that reflected who we were now rather than who we'd been during our darkest moments. As I write this today, 3 years after that confrontation in the restaurant that changed everything, I find myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that emerged from such a devastating period. I wouldn't wish financial exploitation or family betrayal on anyone, but I also recognize that the crisis forced me to confront unhealthy patterns and build a stronger, more authentic life than I'd previously thought possible. I'm approaching my 76th birthday with more confidence, better relationships, and clearer boundaries than I had at 72. My financial situation isn't ideal, I'll never fully recover the savings I lost, and I'll need to work longer than I'd originally planned. But I'm earning income doing work I find meaningful, and I've learned to find security in my own capabilities rather than just in my bank account balance. Most importantly, I've learned that love doesn't require sacrifice of the self. The relationships in my life now are based on mutual care and respect rather than one-sided service and exploitation. I can be generous and supportive without being taken advantage of. I can care deeply about other people's well-being without making their success my primary responsibility. David has continued his growth and change, building a career that aligns with his values rather than just his financial ambitions. He's in therapy, working to understand how he developed the mindset that allowed him to exploit people he loved. He's volunteered with organizations that help victims of financial fraud, using his experience and skills to prevent others from falling victim to similar schemes. He's also begun dating someone, a teacher named Rachel, who seems to appreciate his thoughtfulness and integrity. When he introduced us, I was struck by the way he spoke about her, with respect and admiration rather than calculation about what she could do for him. Their relationship appears to be built on equality and mutual support, very different from the extractive dynamics that had characterized his business partnerships and family relationships during his darkest period. But perhaps the most meaningful change has been in how David talks about success and failure. Instead of measuring his worth by his income or professional status, he's learned to evaluate his life based on the quality of his relationships and the integrity of his choices. He's discovered that living authentically, even when it requires difficult sacrifices, is more satisfying than achieving external success through exploitation or deception. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they didn't happen without intentional effort from both of us. Rebuilding trust and establishing healthy boundaries required months of consistent behavior, honest conversations, and mutual willingness to acknowledge past mistakes. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, times when old patterns resurged despite our best intentions. But we persisted, both individually and together, and the relationship we've built feels solid in a way that our previous connection never did. It's based on reality rather than illusion, on mutual respect rather than hierarchical obligation, on genuine care rather than guilty responsibility. Looking back now, I can see that the crisis wasn't just about money or business ethics, it was about fundamental questions of respect, autonomy, and the nature of healthy relationships. The financial exploitation was devastating, but the emotional dismissal and manipulation were equally harmful. Learning to recognize and respond to both forms of abuse was essential to my recovery and growth. I share this story with you because I know that many people, particularly older adults, face similar challenges with family members who've learned to see them as resources rather than people. The specific details may vary. It might be emotional manipulation rather than financial exploitation, adult children making demands rather than business partners, but the underlying dynamic is often the same: someone you love treating you as if your needs and feelings are less important than their convenience or ambitions. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, I want you to know that you deserve better. You deserve to be treated with respect and consideration by everyone in your life, including family members. You deserve to have your questions answered, your concerns taken seriously, and your boundaries respected. You deserve relationships that are based on mutual care rather than one-sided sacrifice. I also want you to know that it's possible to change these dynamics, even with people you've been enabling for years. It's not easy, it requires courage, consistency, and often professional support. But it's possible to establish healthy boundaries, to demand respectful treatment, and to build relationships that honor your worth as a person. Sometimes, like in my situation with David, the other person is able to recognize their harmful behavior and make genuine changes. Sometimes they're not, and maintaining your well-being requires limiting or ending the relationship. Either outcome is better than continuing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth and depletes your resources. The support systems that helped me through this process, the legal assistance, the counseling, the support groups, the friendship with Elena, were all available in my community, and similar resources are likely available in yours. You don't have to navigate these challenges alone, and you don't have to figure everything out independently. Most importantly, you don't have to wait for other people to change before you start protecting yourself and building a life that reflects your own values and interests. My journey toward healing began not when David apologized, but when I decided to prioritize my own well-being regardless of how he responded. The apartment where I live now is the same space where I felt so isolated and exploited 3 years ago, but it feels completely different because I've changed from within. I've filled it with plants and books that bring me joy, with photos of friends and activities that represent my own interests rather than just my role in other people's lives. It's become a refuge that reflects who I am rather than just what I do for others. The city outside my windows is the same Chicago I've called home for decades, but I navigate it now with more confidence and purpose. I know my own worth, my own capabilities, my own boundaries. I contribute to my community not because I desperately need to feel useful, but because I have genuine skills and experiences to offer. The relationships in my life have become more authentic and satisfying because they're based on equality rather than exploitation. People appreciate my company for who I am, not just for what I can provide. I can disagree with friends and family members without fearing abandonment because I understand that healthy relationships can accommodate different perspectives and preferences. This transformation wasn't something that happened to me, it was something I created through deliberate choices and sustained effort. It was painful and difficult, but it was also empowering in ways I never could have anticipated when the crisis first began. 3 years later, I can honestly say that my life is richer, more satisfying, and more authentic than it was before David's betrayal forced me to confront these issues. The financial losses were devastating, and I wouldn't minimize their impact on my practical security. But the personal gains, the self-respect, the healthy relationships, the sense of agency and purpose, have been transformational. If you're facing similar challenges, whether with adult children, spouses, other family members, or friends who've learned to take advantage of your loyalty and generosity, I encourage you to consider that you have more power to change your situation than you might realize. You can't control other people's choices, but you can control your own responses. You can establish boundaries, demand respect, seek support, and build a life that honors your worth as a person. The journey isn't easy, and there are no guarantees about how other people will respond to your changes. But there is one thing I can guarantee: you are worthy of respect, care, and consideration from everyone in your life. You deserve relationships that enhance your well-being rather than drain it. You deserve to feel valued for who you are, not just what you can provide for others. As I finish sharing this story with you, sitting in my living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon with winter sunlight streaming through the windows, I'm filled with gratitude for the unexpected gifts that emerged from such a difficult period. The crisis forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed, to establish relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, and to build a life that truly reflects my values and interests. David will be here for dinner this evening, along with Rachel, and we'll prepare a meal together while sharing stories about our week. The conversation will be relaxed and genuine, without the undercurrent of manipulation or calculation that once characterized our interactions. We'll disagree about some things and find common ground about others, and both responses will be perfectly acceptable within the framework of respect and caring that now defines our relationship. Tomorrow, I'll return to my work at the Literacy Center, where I'll help other immigrants navigate challenges I've faced myself. I'll attend my weekly support group meeting, where I'll continue learning from other parents who've rebuilt their lives after family betrayals. I'll call Elena to plan our next visit, and I'll tend to the plants that have transformed my apartment into a space that feels genuinely like home. This is the life I've built from the ashes of betrayal and financial exploitation, not perfect, not without challenges, but authentic and satisfying in ways that my previous existence never was. It's a life based on my own values rather than other people's expectations, my own interests rather than other people's needs, my own worth rather than other people's approval. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone you loved was treating you as a resource rather than a person? Have you wondered whether you're being too sensitive when family members dismiss your concerns or exploit your generosity? Have you struggled with the balance between being supportive and being taken advantage of? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to begin their own journey toward healthier relationships and greater self-respect. And if this story has resonated with you, if it's helped you recognize patterns in your own life or given you hope that change is possible, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. These stories matter, and sharing them helps ensure they reach people who might benefit from knowing they're not alone in facing these challenges. Thank you for listening, for opening your hearts to my experience, and for being part of a community that believes everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their age, their relationship status, or their ability to provide financial or emotional support to others. Your worth is not determined by what you can do for other people, it's inherent in who you are as a human being deserving of love, respect, and consideration. Remember that every day offers a new opportunity to choose relationships and behaviors that honor that worth. You have more power than you realize to create the life you deserve, and you don't have to wait for anyone else's permission to begin.